the same old Russia, which is an existential threat to Ukraine, to any neighboring country, to the world, to whatever. This is an evil colonial empire. So this is the problem, and the decision to go back to Russia, which was tactically not very wise and fatal in this case, was part of this of the thinking. Was not surprising at all.
And so, fighting essentially a psychopathic killer and his enablers with information is potentially not going to work here. I use this as an example of coming to a knife fight with a spoon. You're not going to come off too well in that instance. Does Ukraine give us a template for how this kind of regime with murderous intent need to be tackled? We have the Orange Revolution and then we have Maidan, where people are prepared to use violence, to resist violence and to survive. I mean, is that perhaps more of a template for how to resist, rather than this sort of informational warfare?
So the events in Ukraine during the Revolution of Dignity demonstrated that it's really hard to fight using democratic measures, democratic tools, in a country that is ruled by a regime that despises democracy, where democracy simply doesn't work. And this is when you definitely have to use force in order to reach your goals. And the goal in Ukraine, the whole goal of the Revolution of Dignity was removing the dictator, removing the pro-Russian influence in Ukraine, and conducting democratic elections, which was done. A lot of people who say that it was a coup and everything else, they don't understand that the result of this revolution was democratic elections of government and president. And since that time we had several elections. And basically Ukrainian revolution apparently was the only revolution in the Eastern Europe that actually was successful, comparing to what happened in Belarus, what happened several times in Russia.
Georgia is still sort of holding.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is why even when we talk about the Russian oppositionists who say that Ukrainian way is not our way, like Max Katz, for example, we should not listen to Ukrainians because this is not our way. Well, I think that they really should do that, because our revolution was successful. And we managed to remove the dictator that was killing our citizens. And basically, even though he was also democratically elected, because he falsified, he forged elections several times, but still, he basically betrayed the idea of being a president who guaranteed things like Ukrainian language, who guaranteed the integrity of the Ukrainian state, who implemented this informational campaign that split Ukraine in three categories, different sorts of people, which was insane. Ukrainian revolution was a success in the end.
And this is an interesting one, because this mythology that Russia is unique, Russia is distinct, Russia has to have its own way, it cannot learn from other political processes in other countries. You might think that that is something that has been spread under Putinism, but I heard this same idea in the 90s and it set off some alarm bells. I thought, everyone is saying this to me. And it's as if everyone's watched an advert, as everyone's watched the same strapline, as if it's been coded into their heads. I wonder whether that idea dates back maybe into the Bolshevik period.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because, speaking about, Russian talking heads and public figures, one of the strongest non-Kremlin narratives is normalizing narrative, and the gallant figure of this normalization is Ekaterina Schulman, who an extremely successful political pundit. So she's calling herself a political scientist. She actually hardly publishes anything. She's all the time on, on YouTube. And what she's been doing for very many years, long before the full-scale invasion started and long before she ended up in exile, she's been normalizing everything. We are just a country like any other country. We are a society just like any other society. So this there are two narratives of Russia being very unique and Russia being totally normal. They paradoxically coexist. And speaking about malign information manipulations coming from Russia. They are not necessarily, intentional, but some narratives that originate from in the opposition circles or in circles opposing the Kremlin, not sympathetic with the Kremlin, may be similarly dangerous. So this fixation, for example, of people like Navalny and of the Russian opposition in general on corruption suggested that this regime is driven by financial interests, by material gain. This is their objective. And it influenced the view of the regime in the outside world to an enormous extent. So this misconception of Putin as a pure kleptocrat who would never risk losing his assets was one of the reasons, why this crisis happened. And we shouldn't underestimate the role of the regime opponents in Russia. So they were endorsing this narrative that they are thieves, and only thieves. And corruption and is a different kind of economic interest. So you can govern in favor of your economy, of your corporations, of your whatever, or you can govern in favor of your cronies. But this is the same type of government. And if you have, if you are driven by ideas of domination, if you are driven by imperial ideas, if you are driven by stuff like that, it's totally different motivator. It's a totally different challenge, and you have to oppose it in a totally different way. And this is one of the reasons why it was so difficult, to break the big Russian narrative about, there is a different Russia. We just have to tread carefully and not to break, our future relationships and business ties or whatever, so there is certainly such thing as disinformation coming from government-controlled or government-inspired sources, but the whole Russian manipulative bubble has to be considered as a whole. And unfortunately, the opposition groups and opposition media are a part of this. They provide also very important and correct insights in investigative journalism and so on and so forth, but they also endorse some narratives that are extremely dangerous and that are align themselves with Kremlin narratives.
Because there is the reason why, the idea of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the supremacist Russian idea, there's a reason why it's based on, skryepy, what Russians say, skryepy,
Fixtures,
yeah, basically. So there's
Solzhenitsyn, by the way.
yeah, there are several of them. There's Russian church, Russian exceptionalism, Russian Russkaya dusha,
Great Russian.
Russian militarism, Russian sportsmen, great Russian history, and those are
and
foundations.
space exploration, ignoring the great.
Kinda. There's a reason why this idea is strategic in Russia, because it doesn't matter if you follow the Russian agenda or you're oppositionist, but over time, when generations of people are raised on those ideas, they became basis for everyone. People who support the Russian exceptionalism and supremacy, and people who believe they are oppositionists. That's why they have to re-educate. But again, it's a big problem because, Russian regime in its different shapes and forms over the years spent tremendous resources on raising those generations of brainwashed people, and it will be really hard to reverse this process unless we spend approximately the same amount of resources and time.
And this is an interesting point here, because I think the commonality between the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century in Russia is that whoever you are, whether you're intelligentsia, working class, whatever, you don't necessarily have any agency over your fate. Or if it's political agency you're talking about, you have none at all, have never had any. And that leads to all sorts of fantasies and divergence from reality and myth-making. Now, this isn't to say that people in the east of Ukraine, because they spoke Russian, were Russian, but this idea that organic politics wasn't real, this idea that democracy isn't a real thing, that wasn't totally absent in Ukraine either in 1991. There were a lot of people who didn't necessarily feel it, understand it, live it, or have experience of exercising political agency. How did that evolve from the point of independence? Now, you could say that the culture of freedom and volia was there, but to translate that into a belief in the power of democracy, that must have come over several years. How did that evolve and percolate out through the country?
I think that it started around 2004. Around 2004, when Ukrainian people showed their incredible skills in terms of self-organization. When the Orange Revolution began, again, it began with dictator Yanukovych forging the elections, and those massive cases of falsified, those election bulletins just dropped into the boxes in packs, which doesn't happen in the real life when they're dropped there one by one, but there are like packs of them inside of the boxes. And the regime expected that people would just swallow that, apparently they still thought that, Ukrainians are basically like Russians, they don't protest much, which was not the case, because Ukraine, I don't know, is it fortunately or unfortunately, but Ukraine was basically the cradle of, protests since early 20th century and centuries before. And that's when Ukrainians went on the streets and said, no, we're not buying that. We have to, cancel those elections, because this is what we see. It's not supposed to be like that. It's not the democracy. And that's in my memory for the first time when Ukrainians showed their self-organization and they showed that they want to be a democratic society like the rest of the Europe. So I think it's my personal opinion, but early 2000s is when we saw this the evolution towards democracy in Ukraine. And later, of course, it was confirmed by the Revolution of Dignity. And again, the Revolution of Dignity showed this incredible self-organization of Ukrainians, because again, those people who say that, you know, it was a coup, they don't realize that a coup is, according to all kinds of vocabularies, right? It's when some power takes control over the country, be it religious organization or political organization, military, whatever. But in the Revolution of Dignity, which is very important, hundreds and hundreds of non-government organizations and just common people took part because they could not stand the idea that some pro-Russian dictator will be turning our country into like fifth world country. You know, we wanted to be a democratic country, and I think all Ukrainian people demonstrated their will 100% during their revolution.
Nikolai.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would go probably too far if we would start discussing, you know, fundamental differences between the Russian society and the Ukrainian society, but there are some fundamental differences indeed, and they've always been there. Russian society is extremely hierarchical, and it's organized around hierarchies, and people are trained to, you know, to understand finest nuances of who relates to whom, how on this 3D hierarchical, you know, thing. And the Ukrainian society is in tendency very egalitarian, which is one of the basic differences. It has never been totally suppressed under the Soviet rule, and if I may give you an example, an opposite example from Germany. If you look at the election maps, you will realize that the right-wing populist strongholds are the same, basically the same places that were Nazi strongholds in the past, where they gained their greatest successes before the coup. And the population has completely changed, and there is a huge proportion of migrants and internal migration and so forth. But there is this kind of, you know, institutional memory. What makes a city a city? What makes a country a country? And this is what we are looking at here. It can manifest itself in different forms in different circumstances, but this is what actually happened here. And egalitarian does not necessarily mean democratic, but this is easier, you know, to come from egalitarian to democratic than from strongly hierarchical to democratic.
It's like you've got the right elements in the right place, so it can emerge.
And this is why this is why it is probably very problematic, you know, to just adopt some methods from Ukraine and try to implement them in other places. Let's put it like that.
I agree with Nikolai, because comparing to Russians who have this strict hierarchy, Ukrainians, which is it's our feature, which is both good and bad, but Ukrainians generally don't really like authorities. You know, that's why we would rather live in some kind of anarchy, okay, where a bunch of small communities can cooperate between each other and collaborate and have trade and stuff, but we will never, be commanded by some single person, which of course we try to change over time, but it's, you know, some kind of Ukrainian feature that dates back centuries probably. And of course, a lot of people may say, but this is chaos, you know. But on the other hand, this is democracy. This is exactly the processes every democratic nation went through back in the days, you know. So I think Ukraine has a great potential as a democratic country, 100%.
We'll take some comments in a minute, but this is an interesting point which has been made over and over. I spoke to Peter Pomerantsev just a couple of days ago. He made the same point, is that propaganda cannot invent a problem. It cannot start from scratch. So if you try to convince Ukrainians that statism is best, that sort of chaos is far more detrimental than some kind of oppressive order, you're not going to get very far, because it's not an idea that has deep roots, really. It's going to be almost rejected like an organ that's out of your body. Whereas, and this is very, very broadly speaking, the idea of there being a sort of stateless chaos isn't just something that the Russian regime imposes on the people against their will. It's an idea that has a ready audience that is potentially keen to say, okay, well, no, chaos is terrible. I mean, I can see that Ukraine has developed some benefits here, but yeah, that kind of chaos wouldn't work here in Russia. I've heard many people say, yeah, it might work for them, but we'd all start killing each other if it happened here. Now, whether that's real or not, or whether that's kind of a historical mythology or propaganda, there needs to be some kind of synthesis between the propagandist and the audience, otherwise it's not going to work.
I think Russians are really deeply afraid of chaos because it's a fundamental break of hierarchies and nothing works. And we also have here a very different understanding of what freedom is. Yeah, freedom is just a word that can be filled with very different meanings. And in case of Ukraine, it's most certainly related to dignity, and this is not coincidence that the revolution of dignity is called that and not something else. And in Russia, in this hierarchical society, which is actually accepted by everyone, it's very difficult to understand, even for advanced intellectuals, which we can see very often. So the idea of freedom is generally, for very, very many people, for the vast majority of people, is related to the absence of limits and limitations and restrictions. And it might sound like a paradox, but Putin is actually seen by very many people as a liberator, because, well, the hierarchy, it's a natural kind of state of things. You can't liberate people from, seasons or from rain or from things like that. But you can liberate them from the necessity, to stay at home, and you give them umbrellas or you give them cars and they can move around. And here they can do whatever the fuck they want. They can go and murder if they want.
I mean, not to trivialise it, this sounds like the attempt to liberate the house elves in Harry Potter. They don't want to be liberated, because even though you might live as a slave, you might live in some kind of fairly terrible conditions, you've got your orders, you've got, who's above you, who's below you. You're not given any responsibility. Now, what role does this play? That freedom isn't just about unlimited chaos, but it's about taking some kind of responsibility, making decisions for yourself, having agency. And it seems to me that the Ukrainian interpretation of freedom means taking action, doing something within society or politically or whatever. Freedom isn't just something abstract or passive. It has no meaning in that sense. Is this what terrifies Russians? The idea that freedom would put some kind of burden of responsibility on you as an individual?
Ukrainian idea of freedom was described by Les Podrevyansky like very, very specifically, fuck off from Ukraine, okay? Just let us be. Just do not interfere, okay? And which I think is a beautiful idea. And there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of alliances and forces and yada yada, but Ukrainians always wanted to be like masters of their own land, which we have in our anthem, right? Idea of freedom is when you live the way you want, and generally people want to live prosperously, right? They want to have good well-being, they want to have wealth and things like that. It's normal. For Russians, it's different because Russians are taught, again, according to Dugin and Prilepin and the general Kremlin's agenda, they're taught that you will never live prosperously like people on the West, but it's not your path, it's not your way. Your way is to live in poverty and suffer, but you're suffering not just like some slaves or whatever, but you're suffering as good Christians, Orthodox Christians that will definitely go to heaven after you die. And this is the idea. They see that, for example, people in Ukraine, when Russian invaders came to Bucha, they were shocked that Ukrainians that were always described in the Russian media as, you know, the like Untermenschen, you know, under like low-level people, they live much better than people in Russia because they have like good apartments, cars, clean streets, no dog poop line, you know, scattered on the children playgrounds and stuff like that, which is very typical for like every Russian children playground. But they were shocked that Ukrainians have right to live better than Russians. And that's why they were so much furious. That's why we saw all those washing machines and conditioners snatched from Ukrainian apartments.
Apartments. I mean, when you speak to individuals whose actual possessions have been defiled, you will find that the destruction isn't just from soldiers living in their apartments. It's wanton destruction, defecation on their possessions, absolute obscenities. It's much deeper than just theft or whatever.
It's been described as a widespread phenomenon during the Russian so-called revolution, the Bolshevik whatever, revolt, and the civil war. There is also a tradition that, you know, house break-ins in Russia, especially in the countryside, it happens very often.
That was a real problem. People just having their houses burnt down in the countryside for no good reason. Just
but this is what happens when there are break-ins in Russia. So they don't even only go into your house to steal your things. They vandalize it, and not to cover the tracks, but for the sake of it. And there is an anecdote that I like very much. It's from the early 2000s. There was a big Russian agricultural holding that bought a huge chunk of land in one of the black soil regions, where there was unemployment and all sorts of, depression, post-Soviet depression, and they thought, oh, okay, we come to this region, we give jobs, we give people good conditions, actually, and nothing worked. There was a lot of sabotage on machinery. They could not recruit local workers. They brought workers from other regions. They were attacked by the locals, and they were totally confused. And then they commissioned a sociological service, really big ones, and the objective was to find the motivators. What can we do to make the thing work? And the results were actually stunning. So people were not really interested in a high standard of life. They were not interested in having, running water closets, washing machines, whatever. They didn't object that, but they were not really motivated by that. The only motivator, and this survey is available online. This is very interesting. The only motivator was that the neighbor does not live better than me. And there were some recommendations and how to make this thing work, and it was a kind of semi kolkhoz with a strong authority. And they tried all kind of financial motivators, bone and things like that. Nothing worked. And then there was strong mutual control and firm leadership, and the whole thing is thriving. So this is hard sociology, and hard sociology kind of checked by economy.
And it's a pure form of almost jealousy. It's like you get told what to do, but your fellow people need to be on the same level as you, not given any privilege. So this isn't about rights. This isn't about freedom. It's about privilege. It seems to be the pure interpretation, where you are in the system and what privilege you attain.
Yeah, but this has to do with hierarchies. Because, if you are on the same level, you have to you have to live, in similar way. What do you think? You are better. Yeah, this is a typical reaction. So when people start, it's especially bad in the countryside where people are, closely connected to each other, who know each other well, where there is no anonymity of big cities. Why is he doing this? Does he think, or do they think they are better than us?
To pick up on what you said, OS, this idea that, yes, you've got the Orthodox Church, etc., but isn't there more to it than that? It's not that you've got the Orthodox Church and it's good. You've got the Orthodox Church and it's better than somebody else's church. You might live in poverty, but that doesn't matter because you're part of a great country. Isn't this an essential part of keeping people quiet, is to say, this imaginary thing we're going to tell you, you're great because you're part of this. You might not feel it, but that doesn't matter.
Yeah, absolutely, and it works, unfortunately. I remember several years ago there was this Russian comedian, Zadornov, who became famous in Russia because, so first of all, he was like genuine Russian Nazi, okay, like Russian supremacist, and every stand-up he would start with the words, "Americans are stupid," okay. First time he was banned from entering America after that, and then he started like saying that, like generally, like as if he was talking about people of the West,
all foreigners are stupid. That's okay.
Yeah, and he had like a lot of stand-ups that would portray Russians in different funny and stupid situations. All those situations were extremely stupid, okay, but at the same time he would make people proud, like, look, yes, we're stupid, we're ridiculous, but this is what makes us great nation, the strongest in the world. And whenever I see like Russian comedian bloggers, for example, on a YouTube wearing shapka-ushankas and like drinking vodka and thinking that in 2024, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it looks funny, I feel like really, really sorry for those people that they still live like in the previous world. It's a really hard topic. But things like church, things like sportsmen, things like army, all these is used as foundations of this ideology of Ruski Mir that makes people think that they are chosen and they have this deep connection with cosmos and nature and yada yada and the God, of course. The problem is, like, comparing to other nations, yeah, it's normal to be a patriot of your country, but at the same time you should not hate other countries. Russians perceive all the NATO is Nazi, okay? It's like as if Russia is the only anti-fascist country in the world, and then there's NATO, which consists of multiple Nazi nations that combined dream of destroying this beautiful Russian nation, which is like, it raises several questions, right? Is it so?
And then you see, I don't know if you've watched the 1420 channel, where interviews are done on the street, and something that comes up over and over again, it's a certain generation, typically it's the older generation, and they just say, nas завидуют, they're envious of us, which of course sounds ridiculous, but actually putting yourselves in their position, they don't have any frame of reference.
It's interesting that you mentioned Zadornov, because there was a very remarkable evolution of this stand-up, because originally it was a parody of of backward Russians. So it was some Russian idiot who did stupid things and kept saying Americans are idiots. Very very soon it became sincere. So it didn't. This is also very interesting that you mentioned this, connection to cosmos or to something. For the Russians, it is a big question. What a person means when the person says, "I'm Russian." What does it actually mean, being a Russian? It's not. We know it's not the language. It's not a territory, because, as we know, Russia is borderless, and this feeling of borderlessness is an essential part of this self-identification, or I don't even know how to put it correctly. And then there is this intrinsic, very deep connection of this self-esteem with natural resources. So as if the power of the earth, power of the nature, whatever it is, oil or animals in the forests, they go directly into you. So you are not a part of a people, you're a part of a natural force. And this makes you so unique and so superior. And other people, those idiots, they have to work for their prosperity. We are prosperous and well-off by nature. This is what makes us unique. And this is how this territory is connected, and expansion and the necessity to expand is connected to understand to the identity, if we put it in modern terms. And for Ukraine, it's obviously completely different. This is a people on its earth, in its land, and this is how. By the way, I'm Crimean, and it's always been it's been a long and painful, history of mutual misunderstanding, and Crimea had a lot of difficulties to embrace Ukraine, and Ukraine had a lot of difficulties to embrace Crimea. And then with Crimean Tatars, actually this happened, because for the collective, for the Ukrainian civic nation, and this type of identity, it's perfectly understandable. This is the people on its in its land, in their land. The Crimean Tatars don't have any other homeland, and they don't need any other homeland, and this makes Crimea kind of understandable. And every this is a stupid term, because if you are a Ukrainian, how can you be pro-Ukrainian? But every Crimean who has this sense of Ukrainian civic identity, I would think is extremely sympathetic with the Crimean Tatar cause. this is what makes us Crimeans in this modern, Ukrainian sense, and not in the Russian imperial sense.
And that takes us back to propaganda, because unfortunately propaganda is effective in some levels. It's multi-layered, and you hear many people saying, well, Russian propaganda is simplistic and stupid, I don't fall for it. All that means is you've spotted something you identify as Russian propaganda, but there's a whole load of other stuff which you haven't identified as propaganda, which may be still influencing your thoughts and your behaviours. And Crimea is a classic example of that, because clearly it wasn't always Russian. Clearly over history there's been a process of colonization and displacement of the native population, and yet the narrative that Crimea is not part of Ukraine and the majority Russian speak and therefore, by default are part of the Russian empire, that unfortunately does percolate through, and you still see that narrative amplified and repeated in the media. Yeah. And I'm picking up on one of the questions we've got from the audience here, is why is the media so inept at calling out some Russian propaganda narratives? Someone gave a classic example here, which is that every time Medvedev has one of his brain farts, it is reported almost verbatim in the Italian newspapers, is the example here. But let's not just pick on Italy, because you get the BBC, you get Western press, even in a country like Britain, which is fully, squarely behind Ukraine, you still get absolutely inept headlines, and sometimes you get actual sort of repetition or echoing of Russian propaganda narratives. Why are we still so bad at this? OS?
The problem is, which is not really a problem if we're talking about the democratic society, but people on the West, they were raised with the understanding that they must accept the different points of view whenever you have a discussion, which is basis of democracy. There are people with different opinions, but they can find some common solution, right? Some common idea. And people on the West realize that when you hear some kind of narrative, you try to understand the second party, right? You're trying to walk their boots. Okay, and Russia uses this to basically destroy democracy in the Western democracies, because they go biolabs in Ukraine, okay, or genetically modified locust. Genetically modified locust that was brought by Americans to Donbass to destroy the Donbassian crops. And of course, people, they think majority of people go, well, it's a bullshit. Are you kidding me? And they show some kind of basement where those deathly viruses were created by American military scientists, and they go, well, in this basement they created viruses that were spread by birds and mosquitoes. And you go, this is bullshit. When you take a look at facilities where real scientists produce combat, biological weapons, it's they look absolutely different. They have multiple layers of defense. They're big structures with filters, with filtration stations and guards and everything. Nothing like that. But there are people who think, what if it's true? And this is why Russian propaganda is so dangerous, because when you think, but what if it's true, then you start finding logical explanation why it can be true. When you go and check Russian resources dedicated to flat Earth, okay, they're the most convincing ones. Trust me, I saw a lot of them. But when you watch the Russian channels, you go, oh my God. We've been lied all this time, because they know how to do it, and they know how to influence Western minds. Because Western people, they are open to hear the thoughts of the opponents. And one thing people must understand, that Russia created propaganda. Russia is efficient with propaganda. Russia has no freedom of speech. Russia has no freedom of press. That's why what is even the point in listening to Russian propaganda if their media are so much biased? They give you 10% of information, like Ukraine, there's a corruption in Ukraine. Yeah, there's a corruption in Ukraine, but the rest 90% of information will be like Zelensky bought 2 yachts, Zelensky bought like 3 castles, which were like debunked like 100 times. And people, they get lost, they get confused. So one of the things is to accept the fact that Russia is lying. And for those people who think that, but everybody is lying, no. You have not been to Russia where you have absolutely no freedom of speech and thought. If you stand for 10 minutes outside somewhere with an empty banner, you're done. Yeah.
Russia's not trying to target people like me and you who are going to say, hang on a second, I smell BS here. They're not going to waste their money on those people. So this is almost like it's like a marketing campaign. You're going to say, okay, which of our target audience is more susceptible? What are they susceptible to? Let's try that out. But also, I mean, this could be an interesting scientific study. If you want to actually convince someone to believe in something, that's at the top end of your cost scale. That's really difficult. But if you can convince them to say, well, it might be true or it might not, that's a lot cheaper and a lot less effort to get them to that point, and that might achieve your ends. The other one is, you know, from it might be true, it might not. The flip side of that, and I still hear this, I've heard this from a lot of refugees actually that I've spoken to, because we've helped out. If you can even get them to say, we'll never know. The world is more complex. We'll never know. It's not my place in life. You've already won. Propaganda's won with relatively minimal effort, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. They're using this idea of, you know, implanting and growing cynicism in people. So people start questioning facts and they go, we will never know the truth. The truth is too complicated. We must, you know, listen to both sides. Ukraine, which might be wrong and might be right, and Russia, which might be wrong and might be right. And basically, when you show them the results of Russian atrocities and them destroying cities and killing people and raping women and children in Bucha, in Irpin, they go, but everybody does that, you know. People are growing with this sense of cynicism, which is, again, it's very, very dangerous.
This is the Tucker Carlson line, isn't it? Which,
basically,
to me,
yeah,
pegs him as a propagandist, not a journalist. That's a classic line right there.
Yeah, but this is, well, a great part of the problem is that our Western, and I'm speaking now as a German citizen and resident, that our political elites and our media elites have lost the sense of truth. And our society was virtually corrupted by that. So there is this, you know, general idea now that wrong politics towards Putin have encouraged them. We've been sending wrong signals to Moscow or to Peking, for that sake. But we were also sending the same signals into our own society. And what we see is that people who are responsible for the worst political decisions and who are dangerously close to big-scale corruption, we don't know if they were involved or not, because there were no parliamentary hearings, for example. Those people got no responsibility, like people like our federal president, who was not invited, subpoenaed to hearings. He was elected to represent, to be the figure of respect, the ultimate figure of respect for this country, and this is what we are doing to us. One of the first Well, when the annexation of Crimea happened, there was a lot of debate in Germany, and there were obviously a lot of people who said, "Oh yeah, Crimea was always Russian, blah blah blah." And then our former Chancellor Helmut Schmidt came, and he was already 90-something, an elder statesman, but a very respected figure, and not noticed in being not on the top of his. And he said in an interview, "Oh, Ukraine is even not a nation." To hear something like that from a former Wehrmacht officer is a really big thing. But it was not Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda fills gaps. And this is not the responsibility, of civil society or of whoever to debunk it, to confront it. We do what we can. We do it in the media. We do it as independent actors. We do it as parts of research programs and civil society organizations. But what we actually need is a combined effort of states, of governments, governmental actions in Germany or in other Western countries against, let's call it bullshit, against bullshit. But we also need massive Ukrainian information campaigns, because nobody else can do this.
We'll come to that in a minute, because this is a very interesting idea, how Ukraine, which is on the front line, I almost think of it like, if you're talking about almost a biological sense, an immune system against disinformation, Ukraine is like the bats in the cave. You need a fearsome immune system, because it's so much more of a toxic atmosphere in terms of the virology of it. We'll come to that one in a minute, because I think that's interesting. But to touch on the idea of lies, there are gradations of lies, aren't there? I mean, propaganda will often deal with the small, sometimes seemingly insignificant lie, but sometimes it'll tell the big lie in almost, I dare not almost mention the name here, but Goebbels. The bigger the lie, the more convincingly you tell it, the more passion you put into it, that lie is going to succeed. And you mentioned the one there, that Ukraine is not a nation. I mean, that is a lie so monstrous and so big and so clearly challenged by reality, and yet we see these big, monstrous lies go unchallenged. So I've stunned the audience into silence with that.
I don't know if the word lie is correct here. It's framing. You can tell lots of lies about Ukraine, sure, and big lies, they actually don't last. But the framing stays, and this is way more difficult to, resist the framing and break the framing than to debunk certain lies.
Let's turn to Ukrainian media, because that's a question that's been asked by a member of the audience. What should we be learning from the Ukrainian media in the process of tackling disinformation? And of course, Ukraine and the Ukrainian population is subject to a huge barrage of this disinformation and propaganda, and has been for a considerable period of time. So what have they learned? What do they do well? What do they not do so well?
So I would say that one of the most unifying factors, in terms of unification of our people, and making them less susceptible to the Russian propaganda, was the Russian invasion, unfortunately. Because before it happened, even though we had war since 2014, but we had plenty of pro-Russian movements, we had plenty of different parties and political movements opposing each other, and we could never have any sort of unity, which on one hand it's a normal thing, but on the other hand, personally, I was afraid that eventually, Ukraine will completely will completely lose any sort of same direction, and we would just end up having a civil war. But after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, people united, and apparently some kind of shocking event like this, the threat of physical death of you or your kids, I think it played huge role. But of course, we nowadays have huge experience in fighting Russian propaganda. We are fighting it on the state level using the Center of Countering the Misinformation. Right, it's a department within the Council for Security and Defense of Ukraine. We have also a lot of again, because people in Ukraine so much like to self-organize, we have plenty of voluntary organizations and NGOs that do fact-checking, that do myth debunking and things like that.
And those people are partisans in this information war. But we need armies, we need state actors.
Absolutely. Like, I completely agree with Nikolai, because we have to have some kind of legal solution of fighting the Russian, not only Russian, also Chinese, Iranian propaganda on the state level, on the level of governments and on the level of international governments like the EU, because we have to develop a mechanism of countering propaganda aimed at destroying dememocracies before it's too late. Because it's basically already late. Yeah, but
as far as the military is concerned, everybody understands that you know, the resources have to be comparable. You can't, you know, fight with handguns against cruise missiles, and you have to spend a comparable amount of resources and a comparable amount of money. On the other hand, and everybody agrees that we have to do with the information warfare, but we don't spend almost any resources on that. This is, well, Russia spends billions on propaganda, disinformation, and whatever, and this is built into, you know, entertainment products. You don't recognize it as propaganda on the first sight. You get infected through, you know, popular songs and TV entertainment and whatever. And on the European side, we have like millions. Seriously, and we don't. In my humble opinion, we don't have to think in terms of propaganda. We have to do information campaigns. We have to promote and endorse our vision of things, of the world, our framing of certain things, political events, of history, or whatever. And this requires money. We have to, you know, we need more Ukrainian literature being translated and promoted, and we need, you know, grants for this.
Let's turn to something which is a difficult and possibly unpopular topic as well. Ukraine wasn't necessarily brilliant at tackling Russian disinformation for the first 8 years of the war. In fact, in the East, quite slow to respond and realize that the challenge and threat from it. But when the full-scale war came, they made a concerted effort to exclude oligarchs from media ownership and involvement. Whereas if you compare that to the West, you've got one of the world's largest communication platforms, Twitter, or X as it's been disastrously branded, owned by an oligarch with commercial interests, with relationships with so-called powers which are part of the autocratic alliance of evil or whatever, clear, you know, connections with China, etc., and requirement on resources from that country for his industries and wealth, who is openly amplifying and spouting Kremlin narratives. So one of the problems must be that we have no appetite to tackle that elephant in the room, which is oligarch involvement in means of mass communication. Sorry, big challenging topic there.
Independent media is something that we all need, of course. Maybe we should again develop some kind of legal mechanism to make people owning channels, owning media, responsible for spreading misinformation. Because currently, as far as I remember, Twitter is a leading platform in terms of amount of fake accounts that are used to spread all kinds of narratives, including Russian narratives. So probably we have to have some kind of solution. On Twitter, there is this thing when, for example, when you make a publication, there's community notes that can say, "Dude, you're wrong because this is not true." And people who find it useful, they can agree and promote those community notes. They work, and maybe we can have something like that in other media as well, so people would understand that they're legit. Okay. But how it's gonna work, this is what we should think about, because fighting misinformation is not just fighting lies. It's it's participating in the hybrid warfare, and people must realize that that propaganda and misinformation is a combat weapon. Because hybrid warfare has a clear combat goals, geopolitical, strategical goals that, for example, Putin wants to reach. And that's why they must understand that propaganda coming from Russia is a combat weapon that kills. And apparently, we will come to this understanding somehow that we need to have governments involved into this, because Russian propaganda is promoted and pushed by the state, right? It's a state apparatus. So maybe we should also define some kind of measures by other states and governments to counter this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in the Cold War, the West started institutions like Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and they were adequate to the situation, because
BBC World Service again. I know a lot of people
BBC
listen
World
to that behind the
Service,
Iron Curtain,
exactly.
yeah.
Now they are dinosaurs. They may be good media, maybe less good media, but they are dinosaurs. We can't combat this confusion just with some resource telling the truth. It doesn't work like this. Going back to the Russian opposition, they had this great delusion, that you tell the people the truth and the regime falls. Nothing like that happened. So we need resources, and they have to be state resources.
And we're back to fighting a regime which is murderous, but which also relies on an informational ecosystem. So I think the example of NAFO is a good one. A lot of NAFO people who, and for those who don't know, that's a sort of digital collective, a chaotic digital collective online that seeks to find Russian bullshit and basically dump on it with humor and memes and so on. And it's easy to get disheartened thinking that we're not having much of an effect. But one of the recommendations, and what my guests have recommended, is that, and even one guy who's in Moscow doing this, taking a risk, he said that when he gets depressed, the only thing that helps is to take action, not to sit there and pick at your scabs and get depressed. Taking some form of action is the best salve for that, and the best thing you can do to fight disinformation. So this is kind of an interesting thing, because you may be sitting on your sofa, screaming at your computer screen, typing in, MAGA, blah, 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 or libtards or whatever. You may be sort of screaming at the opposition, thinking you're doing something to counter propaganda. All you're doing is adding to propaganda's intent, which is to get you all to scream at each other and not find common ground and unite. So I'd love to hear your views on that one.
I would say this, 100% if you're actively involved into something, it helps you big time against depression and demotivation. But, you know, we started talking about losing informational warfare. I would also like to say an opposite thing. People in the West, which were the reason I created my channel on YouTube, they impressed me so much with their decency and their support to Ukraine. Because, you know, globally, people have to train to become good people, right? We're all born selfish and evil. It's a truth, right? When you look at the kids playing in the, you know, the kids' playground, and they beat each other like they want to steal the toys, and you know, yeah, this is what we are from the beginning. But we have to learn how to be better people, and people on the West, they surprised me with this, that they're friendly, they're open, they have sympathy towards Ukrainians, they feel our pain, that's why they want to help. And Russian propaganda is directed, it is directed on those people, but to the smaller extent. But still, its task is to make the number of people that are basically, they didn't learn anything, bigger and more influential than them. But the positive note of you know, today's program would be this: people, we were wrong about people on the West. They are fantastic and decent and open, and the reason why they will win and why we will win against the Russian terrorism is because they are more active. They can fight for their ideas, while people who support Russian terrorism, they are driven by feelings like hate, laziness, and greed.
And despair as well.
Yeah.
Despair works too. Nikolai.
This is all very optimistic. Yeah, I have my, you know, statistic ideas, and I think, yeah, all this is very, very important as a volunteer movement. Is very important in what makes up a society. What makes Ukraine is this great amount of solidarity and the involvement of, you know, very many people from very different walks of life into a direct war effort in very many different ways. But this is the army that fights the war. And one without each other that doesn't make very much sense. And this is what we need on the information battlefield. We need state powers, democracies, to take action. And this is where the volunteers and partisans would play a crucial role. The state doesn't have to do everything, but it has to create the framework. You can't block Russian resources, the government can. You can't arrest, bank accounts, the government can. You can't go after people who spread malicious narratives, the government can, but you can detect these people, you can debunk lies, you can you can do what you do in a brilliant fashion, but you can't you can't do the government's job. Yeah. And one of our tasks as citizens, as a civil society, as academia, as whoever, as independent actors, is to direct demands. We have to formulate them. We can't just sit and expect some clever guy at the top to figure out what is best. But we have to communicate this, right? Yeah, please do this and that.
Well, this is going to be the last question because I think we're almost out of time, and I'll start with you, Nikolai, and then we'll have Operator Starsky sort of close with a final comment on this. And let's get to the point where Ukraine is victorious. How important is it for us to learn these lessons on information warfare as it currently exists, but also carry on innovating? Because even when Ukraine is victorious, the informational attack is definitely not going to end. It's not going to stop evolving. The intensity is not going to reduce. It may even increase. So how important is it for us to carry on innovating, learning, sharing, and, as you say, perhaps working with government more closely to tackle?
Yeah, we have identified actually the threat, and we have to act accordingly. And as we know, what does it really mean when or if Ukraine is victorious? When all the territories are liberated, it's not necessarily the end. Yeah, they can shell liberated territories or do any other bad stuff. So we have to confront all the threats. Including information threats. That's it, and we have to invest like really a lot of resources, because it's not only the threat that's coming from Russia. This is the internal threats, and this is what actually fundamentally endangers liberal democracy, the good old liberal democracy.
I completely agree, and I can only say that I believe that this mechanism should be implemented not only on the level of governments, but above the level of governments, on the level of, for example, United Nations, because there will always be cases of propaganda coming from different parties, governments themselves. So we have to have control over our governments as, you know, as democratic and free people. Rivalry is not bad generally, but rivalry should exist in the form of friendly competition. Anywhere, in business, in life, in political clashes, it must exist as friendly competition. It should not be threat to your life, to your freedoms, which exactly what Russia wants. And we should always remember that.
Well, this has been a fantastic panel. I'm very grateful to my two guests here and to everybody that's taken part in this marathon session. Please do, before you check out, make sure you scan the QR code, copy the link for donations. We don't want to just make this a day about information. We want people to take action and support Ukrainian victory by donating to help the armed forces. As Nikolai says, there's no point in fighting information unless you also fight the military battle and ensure the army is equipped and can fight back against Russian aggression that is happening every hour of every day in Ukraine. But thank you for staying with Ukraine. Thank you for staying with these issues, and we hope you carry on following all the channels of the people who have participated today.